Okay, welcome everyone. How are you all doing this Friday morning? I'm Charles Ellison, and welcome to another Micro Summit, which is being brought to you by the Council of State Governments Council on Communities of Color. Go to csg-erc.org for more information. I'm your moderator for this morning. I want to welcome everyone that is in the audience that's watching this, and want to thank our panelists as well. I want to thank Debbie Page, who is Senior Policy Director for the Council on Communities of Color, and just overall for the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. And this is her brainchild. She's made this possible. You see her there. She's actually to my left of the screen, doing a fantastic job, and really appreciate this. Also want to appreciate and give thanks to the chairman of the CSG-ERC Council on Communities of Color, State Senator Kevin Parker, who's also made these discussions very possible. We're going to get right to it. I know we're a little bit late, and I appreciate everyone's patience. We had sold out registration for this event a little bit later on during the course of the discussion. Audience members will be able to ask questions, but by Zoom group chat. That will happen by Zoom group chat. Please keep your microphones at mute, and please stop your videos so you can watch, and you can also submit questions to the right of your screen in the Zoom group chat. Welcome to our discussion, Black People Under Attack, What's the Policy Change? And so we're hoping for a very fruitful discussion about not just policy changes, but also looking for policy solutions. So this is a solutions-based discussion. We'll be focusing on the topic of police violence, policing reform. Also, we're going to look at, this is a topic that we've discussed before, we're going to be looking at the topic of 911 abuse as well. That's a topic that we have discussed in earnest here at CSG, ERC, CCC, and have tried to craft some policy over it. We've actually been talking about that for a couple of years now. Let's go ahead and get right to it. Senator Parker, how do we channel this protest energy, this unrest energy, into something that is actually constructive and that also translates into concrete policy steps? That's a very tough ask, especially in a time like this. I want to get your initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say good morning to you, Charles, and as well as good morning to Debbie and Paige and the illustrious panel that I'm happy to be part of. And Debbie, thank you so much for your work and for getting us on track, and the folks at CSG for making this conversation possible. You know, I want to first, secondly, I guess, thank the protesters, right? Because they've actually created an environment that has allowed us to really, get into this conversation. Right now, I'm actually missing a Zoom call with the members of the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Caucus, along with the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader right now, that's happening on the issue of police reform. And then when I get off this call, immediately the Democratic Conference of the State Senate is going to have a Zoom call to pick up those conversations. And let me just say, as somebody who has had their own little relationship with law enforcement, I've been one of the leaders in New York State around the issue of police reform. I put in the first bill around what's called 50A, which allows personnel records to be released in order to get information about bad conduct about police. I put in one of the first bills around a special prosecutor to break up the incestuous relationship between the police and our district attorneys. I have a bill on a statewide bill on an independent inspector general around law enforcement to look at the policies and practices of the police department. And I have the leading 911 bill that really would create a civil penalty for people calling 911. And so, as well as CIT, which I think also was important, these crisis intervention teams, which would help begin to train police and create a kind of what I refer to as a fourth response to 911 in order to make sure that people who have mental illness and maybe be having a bad day don't wind up criminalized because of the police inability to deal with their issues, right? And so, like, these issues have been really important to me going over a decade. I've been in the state legislature now it's my 19th year. And we haven't had a chance. So the bills have been there, the conversations have been there, but we haven't had a will to actually bring the bills to the floor even despite, with all due respect, even despite the African-American leadership at the top of the food chain in legislative conferences. And so, the protesters and this moment has created, and unfortunately, this way unfortunately has been paved with the blood of many, but in particular with the blood of George Floyd. And so, we remember him and give our condolences to his family. But I think that we're now kind of getting to a place where those conversations can happen. And I expect to stop their cities from burning, that white people will vote for some of this legislation, and we'll get governors to finally sign off on legislation that they should have signed off over a decade ago.
We're just now hearing State Senator Kevin Parker, chair of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. Also, he is a New York State Senator representing the 21st Senatorial District. He also chairs the Telecommunications and Commerce Committee in the New York State Senate. I want to bring in the legislators first, particularly members of the Council on Communities of Color, and that also includes State Representative Chris Rabb, representing the 200th Legislative District in the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, excuse me. Representative Rabb, how are you doing? I hope you're driving safely.
I am. I'm pulling over actually just to give you my full attention.
All right, good. In this unrest moment, State Senator Parker describing some of the legislative solutions, the package that he's putting together. What are you working on right now? How are we translating this big, energetic but also volatile and uncertain moment into policy prescriptions? And particularly from the perspective of one of those cities that's been hardest hit, not just by the pandemic but also by unrest.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the Zoom call, Senator Parker. It's great to see you again. Big fan. We cross paths quite a bit, and we are of like minds. So in Harrisburg, we're the largest full-time state legislature in the country. It has been majority led, or led is I'll put that in air quotes, for the past 3 decades or so in both chambers. And we have members in positions of power who don't believe that the pandemic is real, who do not put up or do not allow for any meaningful legislation that addresses police reforms, criminal justice reform, beyond tweaking the edges. But what we're working on now is pretty amazing. Within the past 72 hours, local and state electeds, largely African-American, have come together and put together a proposal that is essentially something we introduced last year on the heels of the acquittal of the white cop who executed a teenage, unarmed Black young man outside of Pittsburgh. And we have gotten the governor to put forth executive actions to address a number of the issues that have not been addressed through the legislative process. And I just came from a presser just now, which is why I'm late, at City Hall. I'm here in Philadelphia, where members of City Council are talking about what they are doing, inclusive of overhauling the proposed budget by our mayor, Jim Kenney, where he put in a $14 million increase to the police department when everything else is being cut. And members of City Council do not even know what's in the police department's budget. All I know is I was with folks in front of the police headquarters yesterday, looking at the wounds of journalists and healthcare providers who were at that melee a couple of days ago, where they were shot with rubber bullets and tear gas, which has not been deployed by the Philadelphia Police Department since 1985. And so a number of us in a unique moment on the local and state level are talking about policies and actually asserting our pressure based on the very important protests that have been going on across the city and across the state to get it done in ways that it has not moved legislatively. But I do believe that we will have some progress legislatively, even if it means waiting till after November, where many of us believe that Democrats will be back in the majority. And those of us who represent these vulnerable communities will lay into our white Democratic colleagues who have not spoken up, who have not co-sponsored legislation, who have not shown up at rallies or publicly advocated for these issues.
Thank you, Representative Rabb. I want to go to Professor Christina Greer, Professor Christina Greer, a political science professor at Fordham University in New York City, but also she is politics editor for the Griot.com. Many of you are probably familiar with her. She joins us occasionally on my show, Reality Check on WURD in Philadelphia, but you also catch her quite a bit on MSNBC. Christina, when you hear this, when you hear what the legislators, the policymakers, the folks in the legislative trenches are describing, is that enough, right? Because a lot of this protest energy is saying, enough now. We want changes now. In fact, the word reform may sometimes suggest or indicate something moderate or something, even Representative Rabb hinted at that, something where it's just a tweak. I remember seeing a tweet, or a tweak rather. I remember seeing a tweet recently from, I think it was Councilman Jeremiah Ellison out in Minneapolis, where he was saying, we are going to dismantle, those were his words, we are going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. So are the legislative tweaks or changes or reforms that you're hearing about from folks like a Senator Parker or a Representative Rabb, is that enough? Is that immediate enough?
Well, first of all, I think we should be inspired by the convergence of protest politics turning into electoral politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's a both and we know Black folks in this country have only gotten things because of protest politics turning into substantive policy change. So if we think of a place like Ferguson in 2014, that activism translated into substantive changes that we saw in city council, and obviously 2 nights ago they elected their first Black female mayor of Ferguson. So what I think is important for people to realize is that we don't want this Machiavellian provinces easily won or easily lost. If things happen too quickly, then they're not built on a foundation and a base. And so if we want change and to dismantle the system, we need to think clearly and critically about what system we want to put in place. Far too often, we want to just substitute one problematic system with another. And so as we break down anti-Black racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, the foundation of this American project, we have to really think about our elected officials and the structures within which they work to really help us figure out a new system. Because oftentimes people don't understand the various levels of government. So we have a local, state, and federal level. And so the demands that you may put on your city council member may be out of his or her control. The demands you may put on your state senator may be something that you should be asking your member of Congress. And so that's a failure on our part as an educational structure to not fully articulate basic civics in this country. But I think a lot of people in power aren't too keen on making sure Americans have a basic civic structure, because that means they're accountable. And so what inspires me right now is the fact that so many people are waking up to recognize that they actually can implement change, both on the streets, but demanding policy changes within their district attorney structures, as we've seen in Philadelphia and various boroughs in New York. They can make demands to change not only who's in power, but the conversations they're having once they're there. And so I'm really motivated by this particular moment because we have our elected officials, many of whom are listening, some for the first time, some like my colleagues on this call who are saying, we've been ringing this alarm, and now their other colleagues are going to join them in some of the policy issues that they've been trying to get on the table because of this sense of urgency. But Senator Parker and Representative Rabb, I mean, they're not new to this party. Many of their colleagues are. And we can capitalize on this moment and use this energy to actually have real substantive change and build these coalitions in a way that we need to.
We're going to have Professor Kalila Brown-Dean now join in the discussion, political science professor at Quinnipiac University, also author of, you see the book actually to her side, Identity Politics of America, just recently released. Kalila, 30 years we've had an accelerated discussion about police violence and the need for a radical reform or restructuring of policing in America. So what, since Rodney King, right, about nearly 30 years ago, then a little bit later on, Ferguson, Baltimore, now we're here, it's nationwide in multiple cities since the death of George Floyd. And let's not forget also Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. So we've been having this accelerated discussion. What makes this moment, however, different from what we've seen in the past, what we saw with Baltimore Ferguson and LA in the 90s? What makes this moment different? And now, so whatever makes it different, how are we going about that towards like real restructuring? I get a feeling reform's not the key word or the buzzword. It's really overhaul and restructuring.
So I think we cannot underestimate the importance of dealing with the COVID pandemic at the same time that we are dealing with this pandemic of anti-Black racism that has been here since the founding of this country. And so my concern is that if we talk about police violence in a vacuum, then we stop addressing the broader conditions that have led us to this place. And so think about what it means for state budgets, for municipalities that are looking toward July 1 as their budget. And to me, your budget is a moral statement. It is a statement of your priorities. And so if you continue to invest those monies into wasting taxpayer dollars, and let me be clear about what I mean about that. What does it mean that we as taxpayers not only pay the salaries of people that we expect to protect us, but we also have to pay for the lawsuits and the settlements when they do not do what they are called to do? And so when we think about this moment, what makes it different from the attack on Rodney King, from the assassination of a Tamir Rice, or the murder of an Tatiana Jefferson? It is because we are in this moment when we're realizing that going back to what some folks call normal will not work. And if we think about what it means to come out of this on the other side, whenever that happens, however it happens, what we cannot allow to happen is for people to feel good because they suddenly put forth one measure and say, look, we gave you what you asked for, now let's move on. What will it mean for local governments if, in fact, jobs numbers came out today, people are like, oh, great, look at these numbers, without looking at the impact on Black people, in particular Black women, that unemployment concentration? What will it mean if homeowners lose their homes because they've lost their jobs in that economic uncertainty? What will it mean for the vultures who are already lining up in places like Philadelphia, in New Haven, where I live, so that they can take that land, those land grabs, because people have had to foreclose on those homes? They will fundamentally remake our cities if we don't prioritize that, if we don't put police violence within a broader structure of what it means to affirm the inherent worth. And the last thing I'll say, Charles, about what makes this moment different is the power of social media and the power of young people to connect and communicate in a way that says, you don't get to speak for me. And so while some people feel good because they see police officers taking a knee in a so-called show of solidarity, lest we forget that Officer Chauvin taking a knee is what brought us to this place today. So the time is now to move away from symbols and focus on substance, and to empower people who are most affected to lead that change and lead that call. That's what's different about 2020 as opposed to where we were just 5 years ago.
Going on to Michael Cord. Michael Cord, who is down below, as many of you are watching, we are now halfway through a very, very intense, very fruitful discussion that we're having, constructive discussion that we're having here. Black people under attack. What's the policy change? This is being presented, powered by the Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. Michael Cord is, excuse me, a very busy civil rights attorney in Philadelphia, well-known, also columnist, regular columnist for the Philadelphia Tribune. Michael, do we abolish the police? We've been hearing that conversation, or do we abolish police unions? There's been a re-examination of the relationship between police unions and also city and state elected officials. And if we say, we've had this big conversation, this big protest conversation about abolishing the police, well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative policing model? Is it even policing anymore, right? Is it just, hey, let's focus on public safety? What, in your mind, how are you unpacking that? Oh, Michael, we need you to unmute.
I thought you all on me, but I'm good. First of all, let me say this. I usually, when I'm on a panel, I'm the go-to guy with all the answers. But right now, I'm sitting here taking notes from all the other panelists. So I can simply say what they said and just move on. But give me 2 minutes just to respond to your question regarding abolishing the police. First of all, let me say this. Although I am a lawyer, I always tell people this, Charles, I am not a lawyer who happens to be a Black man. I'm a Black man who just happens to be a lawyer. So I don't talk like most lawyers about using the system to change the system. I'm thinking outside of the box. In regard to your question about abolishing the police, my approach is this. We need a demolition team to go in and to blow up what the police department stands for, but at the same time of bringing in a demolition team to blow up what the police department stands for, we need to have a construction crew available to replace what was blown up. And that construction crew includes making sure, first and foremost, that most of the cops are from that community, not some outsiders who come in like some foreign soldiers into occupied territory and begin to oppress the community. And the bottom line is this: we can't abolish policing itself. As a criminal defense attorney, I got to concede, Charles, I represent some very bad guys who do some very bad things. And I wouldn't want my grandmother, my family, my friends to be exposed to that. So what do we do about it? We certainly need policing, but we don't need the kind of policing that we have now. And we need much more than reform. Having heard from the other panelists, I love their approach about not just reform, because for me, that's just putting lipstick on a pig. It's still a pig. I love what all the other panelists said about changing the entire structure of the system. And finally, let me just say this. As a lawyer, I understand that law follows policy. So it's not much I can do regarding the law if underlying changes haven't been made in the law. So I love the fact that you refer to legislators as policymakers, because that's exactly what they are. And the final thing I'll say is this. Representative Rabb made a good point about some of the great work that the legislature is working on here, headed by the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus. But one of the key things that I want to make sure we do is that we change the law regarding private criminal complaints. Private criminal complaints allows a private citizen to act as a public prosecutor. And I was successful back in year 2000 after a white cop shot and killed an unarmed Black man. When the local DA would not prosecute the case, I came in as a prosecutor and was successful for the first time in Philadelphia history, for the first time in Pennsylvania history. As far as we know, for the first time in American history, we got an on-duty white cop charged with murder, not manslaughter, not assault, but murder. But it was a short-lived victory, because the then DA, a very close friend of the police department, Lynn Abraham, filed an appeal. Now think about that. A defense attorney getting a criminal prosecution against a killer cop, the elected prosecutor appeals that and takes it up to the Superior Court. It should be the other way around. Defense attorney should be appealing conviction and charges, but it was the DA. Long story short, the Superior Court reversed my victory. And they reversed my victory, saying that I did not have the proper clients because I didn't have Donta Dawson as my client. Well, he couldn't have been, because he was murdered by the cop. Because I didn't have the mother and father as my client, they said, the court, I didn't have standing. And the reason why I didn't have the mother and father as my clients, because they refused to come anywhere near me. They were trying to get that settlement money. And I don't blame them. Poor family offered about $1 million. They wanted that. Their civil attorney told them to stay away from me. The law needs to be changed so that any private citizen like me can go in and file a private prosecution without having that quote unquote standing.
I'm going to throw this question out here, and then we're going to open up the question box, the question piece of this session of this micro summit in your Zoom group chat. If you are now watching our micro summit Black people under attack, what's the policy change? You can add your or insert your questions in the Zoom group chat. I will pay attention to that and also relay those questions in real time to our panelists. I'm going to throw a question out here and any of the panelists can jump in. It's not just police, right? It's also the white people who use police. You know, we've had this issue, especially over the past few years, of accelerated being while black, as they call it. You know, the racialization of public spaces, which has always been going on since black people have been in this country, but we did see some intensified racialization or the weaponization of police against black people in public spaces just simply for being there. We saw that a couple of weeks ago with the exuberance incident in Central Park, New York. So how do we put an end to that? How do we start holding white citizens accountable?
Charles, can I answer that?
Go ahead, Christina.
And I think someone's not on mute. I don't know if one of your listeners isn't on mute, but
right. We need to make sure everyone is on mute. Thank you. Thank you for that, Christina.
But you know, when thinking about Amy Cooper in Central Park, and it's not lost on many of us that this happened in Central Park. But you know, the Human Rights Commissioner in the city of New York and that office is, you know, has spoken out about, you know, there needs to be some sort of legislation passed for people like the Amy Coopers of the world who weaponize the NYPD or police departments across the country purely for Black people existing and being free. We saw it the following week when a Black woman was sitting in the park on the Upper West Side and a woman wanted to know exactly where she lived because she didn't feel like she should have been in the park, and she called the police and tried to escalate the situation. So I think that there needs to be some repercussions. Christian Cooper spoke out and said that he did not think that Amy Cooper should be penalized, or he thought that she suffered enough consequences. I do think that that's part of this politics of respectability that a lot of Black folks have. You know, so many people talked about Christian Cooper and his Harvard education and the fact that he was on the board of the Audubon Society. But the fact of the matter is, if Christian Cooper were someone with a do-rag on and an undershirt and a few gold teeth, he would have been well within his rights to ask that woman to put her dog on a leash. So we have to also make sure that we're not choosing which Black people are credible when these things come up, because the onus is now on white people to change their behavior. And until there is a real punishment for people trying to weaponize the police against Black people just simply existing in this country, we're going to see this behavior continuing. As a Black woman in this country, and I know my colleague, Dr. Brown-Dean, lifted up the voices of Black women who have been murdered by the state, of which there have been many. We often talk about Black men, but we have to make sure we talk about Black women as well. You know, a lot of Black women know that there is nothing that beats a white woman's tears. Nothing in this country. And so knowing that, we have to move in a space to try and protect ourselves. And so there has to be real punishment of some sort for people who try to use the police departments as a tool to control Black people. Because by a white person telling a Black person that they will call the police on them purely for existing is essentially saying, I can have you murdered at my whim. And we've seen this time and time again across the country with Black men, Black women, and sadly, Black children.
Mm-hmm. If anyone else wanted to jump in on that question before I go to some of the Zoom group chat questions.
Yeah, so I would say, just to follow up on that, you know, one of the things that I think about is the trauma that our young people and our children are experiencing right now. Not that they don't always undergo trauma, because, you know, a lot of people talk about PTSD as being post-traumatic, when I think that for Black children in particular, it's about perpetual traumatic stress. But I think about the trauma they are suffering right now. I think about what it means for a 17-year-old child in Minneapolis to receive death threats because she dared record the murder of George Floyd. But for that baby's video, would we be having this discussion? So when I think about holding people accountable, because that's what this is all about, right? When I think about holding people accountable for committing acts of racial terror and racial trauma just because they can, then I think about that Amy Cooper should be held accountable for that. That should be a felony offense. It is a misuse of valuable municipal resources to be able to do that. But every area should also have a racial trauma fund, because what will that mean for young people to be able to have access to therapy, to be able to have access to mental health support, to be affirmed in their self-worth, and to keep them out of the other systems that we know once a child of color goes into that system, it is very difficult to keep them out. So our focus should not just be on punishing an Amy Cooper, or, you know, there are many other examples, but from a systemic perspective, how do we hold individuals accountable while also creating a structure that invests in the very lives that have been demeaned and devalued by those acts? People know what they're doing when they call the police. There is a reaction that they want. And there's nothing that moves conservatives and progressives more in terms of finding some consensus than when you start hitting people's pocket and understanding all of the money that is wasted by doing that could be rechanneled into the communities who actually need effective connection.
I'm going to go to
Charles, can I quickly follow up?
Sure.
Very quickly. Both comments by the last two speakers were exactly the points I was going to make, but let me say this very quickly. In cases like we just saw when white women or anybody called the police on Black folks, we do have certain remedies. For example, we, as the victim, can call the police and say, hey, this person did X, Y, and Z, and potentially that could be a filing a false police charge, a police report charge. It could be disorderly conduct. So there are laws on the book that could apply to situations like that. In addition, there's that private criminal complaint thing I talked about. And the third thing is there's a potential civil action we can file against people who do things like that, intentional infliction of emotional distress. And the fourth and final thing is that we have to do some internal thinking and resolving of our own problems. What I mean by that is, and I don't really want to take this conversation outside of where we are, but we're too damn forgiving. We're just too damn forgiving. We seem to too far often give excuses or apologize for white folks' racism. And that's not something, obviously, we can deal with in discussion about policy, but it's just something that really frustrates me. That at the end of the day, we're always forgiving or often forgiving our oppressor.
Charles, let me
ahead,
jump particularly on Dr. Brown-Dean's suggestion about trauma. I actually just put in a bill that requires the New York State Department of Mental Health to do a study on police abuse and police murders and its impact on African Americans across the state. I think that's going to be the beginning of the kind of programmatic remedies that Dr. Brown-Dean is actually talking about. A fund itself, I think, is a little bit difficult, particularly with all the states being, broke. But I think, beginning with a study and then creating programmatic opportunities within existing structures, I think is how we can actually get there, because there's actually money already in the agencies, and how do you create programmatic opportunities within the context of that to do that. One of the things that has to also happen in this context is that we have to really work hard to make sure that there's parity between physical health insurance and mental health insurance, right? And that doesn't exist right now, and we need to work in all of our states to make that happen, because even if you have the programs there, a lot of times access to insurance will stop people from actually getting the kind of service around the trauma that they need to. There are a few states, again, as you indicated in the top of this conversation, Charles, there's a few, we've been talking about this for over 2 years. There's since this, I had an incident in my district that went national with this issue of a woman that they were calling Cornerstone Karen, who called the police on a 10-year-old boy in my district. And that's when I drafted my bill. And the problem is a couple of things, like people have talked about doing hate crimes, people have talked about making it a felony. As Michael will tell you, some of those criteria are really hard to meet in a court of law. And in fact, most folks will tell you from a state legislative perspective, if you have a hate crime statute, which almost every state does, they're very rarely used. And because the standard is so high in terms of, trying to prove what's in the hearts and minds of people. And so we do have to kind of drill down on this a little bit more and figure out kind of how we get to it, which is why, again, I got to a private right of action in my state, because I thought that was what we could get passed and what could be law and still be effective in terms of addressing the issue and creating an economic disincentive for people to weaponize the 911 system against people.
We're going to go to some questions in the Zoom group chat, and just panelists, just to let you know, we did start just a few minutes late, so we may go just a little bit over time. We try to keep it very punctual with these micro summits, but we may take a little bit of host or moderator's prerogative here. But if you have to jump off at the designated stop time, please do, but we're just going to continue the discussion, probably go just a few minutes or several minutes over. I want to go to Donna Cooper, who was saying in the Zoom group chat that she's eager to hear specific policies aimed at improving the outcomes of Black and brown children in the dependency and delinquency systems. Throw that out there too. I don't know if Representative Rabb is still there by chance to also weigh in on that. We might have lost him. I know he was mobile at the moment, but if anybody wants to weigh in on that comment or discussion or question. Also, Debbie Page, our very own Debbie Page, was raising states that don't have, demographically don't have a lot of Black and brown people in them, like New Hampshire. Since New Hampshire does not have a lot of racial diversity, what type of legislation should we be looking at regarding marginalized people and law enforcement? Actually, she's relaying a question from New Hampshire, Representative Linda Massamia. So if anybody wants to weigh in on that as well.
If I could jump in, I mean, look, I don't think that this is a matter of how much racial diversity. The question is, how many people do you have in your, in your caucuses that are for justice? That's what this is, really a question of justice, not necessarily about racial diversity per se. And so things like a special prosecutor should happen regardless of where you are, because the same kind of incestuous relationship that creates a dynamic where police cannot get properly charged with crimes in New York that has a lot of racial diversity is the same dynamic that happens in Maine, right, or Vermont, right? And so or New Hampshire, like you have to do the same things. A stripping away of the personnel protections, not completely. We don't want police officers to be in danger, but we certainly need to have their personnel records available in the context of their prior bad acts, and have that be part of the grand jury conversations. Things like body cams, right? Like I have a bill that's being supported by our Attorney General that would put body cams on all our state police, right? And making sure that we have video evidence of these interactions with citizens generally, whether they're Black, blue, or green. And so, so there's a number of things that you could be doing that are still important, and they're not necessarily race specific, but it is about providing transparency and accountability for an out of control police department.
Mm-hmm. Also, Juan, we have Anna Shields was making this point, or was asking this question. When you talk about demolishing police, and anyone can jump in on this, when you talk about demolishing police as they are now and, quote, bringing in a construction crew and replacing it, how can you actually ensure that it won't revert to what it was? Can you elaborate on what a replacement system would look like? Would that, for example, entail social workers or more social workers within police departments?
In fact, Charles, I did use the phrase blowing up the police department, completely dismantling it and restructuring it. And what I mean the question posed by the person who did ask that's a legitimate question, but we can't say, let's not fix the problem today because we could have problems tomorrow. Well, the house is already on fire today. So we got to do whatever we can to put that fire out. Who knows? It might be another fire in that house tomorrow, next week, next month. But we know right now we got to put this fire out. And in terms of putting this fire out, for one thing, we got to make sure that people live in the city that they police. That's the first thing. So they should live in that city. And more specifically, not that it should be a mandate, but it should be a consideration that not only do they live in that city, but they get extra points in their application if they live in that neighborhood. So we should try to get people who live in the neighborhood to police that neighborhood, because Officer Johnson is not going to bash Ahmaud's head in if he got to go to church with Ahmaud's mother next Sunday. So we want to make sure that people live in the city. We prefer that they police the community that they're from, and we got to change the type of legislation that exists in states like Pennsylvania, for example. In Pennsylvania, there's something called State Legislative Act 111 of 1968. And that State Legislative Act 111 of 68 basically says this: we're going to treat the FOP, the police union, much different and much better than every other labor union in the Commonwealth. We're going to allow something called the American Arbitration Association to dispute the claims made by citizens against cops. And based on that, from 1968 here in Philadelphia, 90% of the complaints against police officers in Philly have been rejected. 90%, even those that are on videotape. So it's incumbent upon us to destroy and dismantle what exists today and come up with something different tomorrow. And something different tomorrow is you got to live in the city, you should be from that community, and legislative acts that protect the police union should be completely abolished.
Vermont Senator Becca Berlin, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, makes a good point here about so much of the law being about the power of language. I'm going to have our political scientists weigh in on this one about how the law is so much about the power of language. And the Vermont senator makes the point that a lot of policy that's crafted can many times, we've seen this throughout history, include a lot of racial, some of it intentional, some of it unintentional, a lot of racial and gender bias, and also white supremacist language. In Vermont, some legislators are contemplating a step in their policy drafting process. We like in certain contracts or other policies or laws that are crafted regarding, for example, the expansion of fracking or some sort of drilling of a resource, there's an environmental impact statement. What about equity impact statements? What's that trend look like right now, especially in a time like this? But have we seen legislatures, whether it's the federal legislative branches or we've seen state and local legislatures, have they been moving in that direction where every policy they craft, it has to include a racial equity impact assessment or statement? Kalila or Christina, if you want to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I just want to address that question in the context of a couple of the questions that we see in the chat, because I think they're interrelated. As to the power of language, think about what it means and what it conveys that we now talk about opioid abuse disorder, right? When in the 90s, it was crackheads and drug addicts. Because now we have a kinder, gentler approach to people who are battling substance abuse addiction. We don't make the same kind of moral judgments that we did in the 90s, which means that we are willing to have a very different approach in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health, but also in terms of how law enforcement interacts with people who are battling this disorder. So language clearly matters. But for me, as opposed to just looking at the language contained within a bill or statute, I think that next step is key, Charles, of looking at the impact. And for every bill that comes through your legislature, whether you are a predominantly urban area or a more rural area, to think about what that impact will be, and then what are you willing to do to offset that impact? For me, what we don't look at enough in terms of language and impact is the way that we speak about education, particularly public education. So to be able to say for every entity that public education is a civil right, full stop, then that means that when these school systems try to figure out what they're going to do in the fall, or what localities are going to do because they're seeing decreased revenue. And we have already seen what the federal government and the Department of Education prioritizes: rollbacks on Title IX, rollback on sexual harassment protections for young people. Then what that means is that if the language is that we prioritize public education for all young people, understanding it will predominantly affect Black and brown youth, then that means that when these school systems are trying to recover, we will not allow privately held charter school corporations to come in and exploit those communities in order to meet their profits without understanding the pain that exists. So language is important no matter where you are in this country, no matter the makeup of your jurisdiction. That is a way that we start to erode some of the structural racism that exists in this country. It's the way we put forth our priorities. But most importantly, it's about understanding the federal government is not going to come to save us. We have to reclaim and uphold the power that exists at the state and local level, particularly when we're talking about issues of equity and justice.
Oh, Christina, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just I want to put an exclamation point on Kalila's last statement, which is, you know, we are now in a states' rights situation, and it's under LBJ in the 1960s. We relied on the federal government for the advancement of civil rights, the Voting Rights Act, Immigration Act, housing policy, in a substantive way. And we now know that there is absolutely no leadership on the federal level. We've got an abdication of the Republican Party. They've turned into sycophants to the President of the United States. He does not understand or respect his role as the executive. We've got a Supreme Court that has all but pledged their allegiance to the president. We have an entire branch of Congress that has done the same. So we cannot look to the federal government for any sort of equitable or substantive change. And so that means, you know, in a place like New York, and Senator Parker knows this better than anyone, you know, the budget of the state of New York is larger than most nations. But sadly, so many citizens and residents of the state of New York couldn't tell you who their state senator or state legislator is. And these are people who are deciding about our education policy, not just our roads and our prisons, environmental policy, reproductive justice, marriage equity, you name it, it's all going through the State House. And so just as Kalila mentioned, we have to sort of focus on the people actually who have real life impact on our lives. It's not just about the president. And largely, you know, I'm a political scientist. I believe in protest politics and electoral politics. And we know that primaries matter. Far too many people, you know, wake up in November and those choices have already been made. We know that roughly 93% of our districts in this country are single party districts. So all the real interest and division and discussion is at the primary level. So I'm hoping that in this moment, I'm trying to translate this frustration and exhaustion into action steps, but people are really taking a much more of a detailed interest in the governance of their own lives and how every single facet of their life is affected by someone who has the power to make decisions. And you know, if you're not speaking up, the status quo can and will maintain.
You know, that's something that's I'm real curious, and I'll go to a couple of these Zoom chat questions, but I was real curious about the role of state attorneys general, right? We're seeing that play out in Minnesota. So state's attorney general, to my understanding, do not have that kind of prosecutorial power in a situation like this. So we had a situation just recently, right, where the Hennepin County DA, that's the DA that oversees Minneapolis, transferred this case, the case of these 4 officers murdering George Floyd, transferred that case of the prosecution to the state attorney general, who happens to be former Congressman Keith Ellison, not related, but Black attorney general, first Black attorney general for the state of Minnesota. Obviously, that's a lot of pressure on Ellison. But what can legislators do? I don't know, Senator Parker, if you want to weigh in, what can legislators do to, or state legislators do to ensure that maybe there should be more prosecutorial powers for if there's a failure at the local level where a local DA has too much of a cozy relationship with the police department, won't prosecute. Okay, well, the state AG can use the state police to come in, arrest those offending officers, those murdering officers, and then prosecute rather than waiting on the DA to transfer that case to the state AG.
No, that's exactly what I've been talking about within the context of what we refer to as a special prosecutor legislation, where you essentially either create a special prosecutor where you bring in an attorney to prosecute those cases, but in most states, you typically will use the legal apparatus that's already there, and you essentially make the attorney general the special prosecutor in the cases that revolve wrongdoing by police or any law enforcement throughout the state, depending on how you want to write the statute. We currently have been operating over the last about 7 to 8 years under a executive order in which the governor has just cases in which unarmed civilians are killed by police officers are reviewed by the governor's office, and then if he deems necessary, then go on to the attorney general to be prosecuted. Most of us think that that's unnecessary red tape, and so legislation that many of us have proposed skips the governor and just essentially in any case that either is dealing with just unarmed civilians who are murdered or any cases, I really think that we should look at, any cases that involve the police department really should go to a special prosecutor. In this particular case, make the attorney general the special prosecutor because they have the resources, they already have the office, is a more efficient, especially economically efficient way to address it. And so we have that legislation in New York. I'm actually hoping and guessing that by next week we're going to be passing some of that legislation. I know some other states are looking at that, but that's really the most important thing to do in order to kind of break up that incestuous relationship between the police officers and the county DAs.
Mm-hmm. I also got Jim McGrath here in the Zoom group chat who's wondering, is it practical to think this can even be solved with state-by-state legislation? Seems to me this must be resolved at the federal level. For example, the issue with gun violence has not been solved with state-by-state legislation.
I don't know. I think that it's like, could the feds solve it? Yes. Is it likely, given the current dynamics that we have in Washington, that will be resolved anytime soon? Absolutely not. And so, particularly in places like the Northeast, where you have progressive state legislators and you have some enlightened governors, you actually can get to a place where you can get enough states moving that you create a race to the top as it relates to the issue of police reform. You're just not going to get it on the federal level. Even the bills that are out there, the Senate. I mean, look, you have when you look at the 50 states of the United States right now, they're in over, I want to say $100 billion worth of deficit. And there's a HEROES Act that was passed by the House that Mitch McConnell and the Senate won't even consider, right? And so we can't even get a basic relief based on COVID, based on a global pandemic. You can't get a relief package through. How are you going to get police reform for a bunch of folks who are racist and think that what's happening with the police is absolutely fine? I mean, if you notice, people are hopping on the president, but frankly, you haven't seen the United States Senate come out and say anything about the death of George Floyd or even put anything forward in terms of dealing with the issue of police reform. They think this is okay. I mean, let's be clear that, white supremacy is the order of the day, and they're not going to go quietly into the night just simply because, people are making a lot of noise. We're going to have to fight tooth and nail to the very end to make sure that the remnants of the lack of police accountability are put to death. And that's why you hear Michael talking about blowing up the system, because that's literally what you have to do. It has to be dramatic and profound. And if you don't do something that's dramatic and profound, not only won't the bad cops get it, but the people who have been fighting for justice won't think that you're sincere and are not going to look at tinkering in the margins as being an actual change in system.
We also have a comment from someone at the Racial Justice Alliance. We have to seriously look into the practicality and effectiveness of the use of the AG. The assertion suggests that the AG is somehow completely disconnected from the county level state's attorneys. It doesn't work here in Vermont, and I doubt that it would work in most other places. That's a comment in the Zoom group chat. Also, Mary Beth Walls saying we need new standardized use of force policies, and we need a new structure for examining excessive force by law enforcement. We need to stop basing decisions on precedent for example, prior excessive force that was previously approved. That's Mary Beth Walsh. I want to ask this too about, and you know, I wish we could have expanded the panel a little bit more, get a little bit more time, but maybe later on get some local elected officials on here too. We didn't have an opportunity to do that, but you know, do we need to, when we look at like reforming or restructuring policing, looking more at a public safety model, do we need to go towards, I'm just doing a little ideation here and thinking creatively, do we need to look at a hybrid approach? For example, I've had conversations about where people are saying, maybe we need, you know, we definitely need a public safety function in Black neighborhoods, for example, but maybe it shouldn't be armed. Maybe it should be more auxiliary, highly trained. Maybe they're trained in martial arts. Maybe they're armed at the very least with tasers. And, you know, if things get very or erupt into violence, then, you know, you have like an, you know, somewhere, some location in a neighborhood, a secure location where you can get arms, or you can call in an armed squad to take care of that violence. So do we need a hybrid, a mix of non-armed or unarmed auxiliary law enforcement or public safety staff or officials, and also armed that only come in for violent situations? Do we need to seriously and vigorously reassess or reevaluate the need for residency requirements? And also, do cops need at least an associate's degree? Not just 90% of police departments require just a high school diploma to get hired to carry around a gun and dispense justice. Do we need to fundamentally change that? Say, hey, you need at least an associate's degree. You need some advanced instruction in different, you know, in different courses on social studies, history, economics to understand these populations. You also need to live in these communities that you patrol. I'm just throwing that out there for some conversation as we start wrapping this up.
Yeah, I just want to raise this point about, you know, whether it's unarmed, if it's extra legal or not. I'm born and raised in Virginia, and right now my hometown is under siege from local militia groups who have been called in by business owners who say, our property is threatened. We need you to come in and support us because we don't believe law enforcement will take us seriously. So it always makes me nervous when we talk about who has the authority and legitimacy to call something a threat and then be able to mobilize action. What I also want to remind people is that if you look at the officers that pulled those students out of the car in Atlanta, the one student from Morehouse, the one student from Spelman, they were people of color. So it's not enough to simply say, just because you look like me, I feel safer. If you are trained within a system and a structure that trains you to see Black and think criminal, it doesn't really matter what you look like once you take that badge off. So we have to look at the ways in which this has become so ingrained in the system that I believe Debbie said, you don't need a gun or a taser to take someone's life. It is simply the power that you think you have to do that. And two last things, Charles, that I think are so important. When I've seen a lot of people asking, what can we do? What can we do? One, your state should have a verified registry of every law enforcement officer who has been removed from duty because of committing these acts of violence. And that database needs to be accessible so that someone does not get fired from a force in Cincinnati and then get rehired to do training in Dallas and be able to spread that terror across the country. The second key thing, and I would not be a good political scientist if I did not say this, is that every state and locality needs to work on full voting rights restoration. Because when I think about who is going to serve on the juries, in this case about the murder of George Floyd, who is going to serve on the jury in the case of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, who is going to demand that police officers be charged in the death of Breonna Taylor, because remember, the only person who was charged was her boyfriend, who was in his home protecting his home via those Second Amendment rights that people in Michigan like to glorify when people show up at the state capitol. If your area decides who can serve on juries based on who is registered to vote, then we have already decided that we cannot have a jury of our peers in a country where the overwhelming number of people who are disenfranchised are Black and brown. So those are actionable steps that can address the big systemic problems and show how police violence rests in this broader notion of whose voices can be heard.
All right, we're going to be wrapping this up shortly. Someone did make the point about, we've been talking so much about police violence in cities, or the need to restructure or to dramatically overhaul police in urban centers. We have not talked about rural areas. We haven't talked about other regions or other locations, the suburbs, rural areas. In fact, we've had, especially with gentrification increasing, we've had Black and brown, especially Black populations, low-income populations, being more and more displaced into the suburbs, and the suburbs are suddenly having to manage new situations in terms of poverty, in terms of the delivery of services, and also how their law enforcement manages these brand new Black populations. So if anyone wants to jump in real quick and speak to that while we got about a couple more minutes.
Charles, I'll just say really briefly, when we think about, say, a place like Ferguson, Ferguson isn't a tier 1 city.
Right.
It's a suburb that has grown exponentially because Black folks are being pushed out of cities, right? Mm-hmm. Keep in mind, after the 60s and the uprisings in the 60s, lots of white people benefited from federal governmental programs, and they moved out to the suburbs because they didn't like all of this integration and diversity that they saw. And then that's when we saw a massive de-investment in cities. Right. When my first day of graduate school, I said I was going to write about cities. This is way before, I met Kalila, and we decided to write about race and politics and elections. But I was an urbanist, and I was told to my face in New York City that cities were dead. You won't get a job. There's no point in writing about cities. Right. And so this was the philosophy, not just of academics, but also of policymakers and elected officials in many ways, that, there's no money here and the tax base isn't here. And so that means, if it's just majority people of color in the city, and we know our chocolate cities that have existed, that's that. Now we've seen over time, white people want cities now. They don't want their McMansions anymore. They want to reclaim their cities. They want cultural institutions. Now, I'm saying all this, ignoring the events of last week, because I do think that we're going to see a nice little shift yet again. But taking this as though I'm making this statement 2 weeks ago, white people have wanted cities back, and we've seen prices skyrocket. Those of us who live in New York, we saw Michael Bloomberg creating a city largely for whites, right, and not mincing words about that. And so Black folks have been pushed out, not just to first-tier suburbs, but to second-tier suburbs, right? Dealing oftentimes with police departments who are not accustomed to seeing people of color, dealing with school systems who all of a sudden feel like they have an influx of people of color. And we're seeing the policies and the systems as a result of that. Now, post what has happened this past week, I'm very curious to see how we saw an era of reinvestment in cities, but as we possibly see more chocolate cities, when certain white Americans are going to say, you know what, this is too much for me, I now want the suburbs again, and we're going to have to see this reversal. We know that policy oftentimes follows the whims of white Americans. And so this is why we have to make sure that our elected officials are well aware of the mechanisms that wealthier white Americans will use to create the society that they want. So when they want cities, they get cities. When they want suburbs, they get suburbs. And unfortunately, the movement of Black bodies in and out of urban spaces based on the whims of whites has to be addressed.
Christina, you just gave me an idea too. We need to have a separate and future micro summit on the future of urbanism, post-pandemic, post-protest, right? Yeah. What's that going to look like? Because on one hand, you could say it's going to look like, well, after like what happened in 1968, suddenly there's like this white flight out of the cities.
Yes.
Or could it be just the acceleration of the gentrification, hyper accelerating the pushing out and displacement of Black residents or non-white residents, and creating cities that look more like fortresses.
Yes.
Like, okay, when you go out there into the suburbs, you stay out there, stop coming into these cities and rioting and creating unrest and protesting, right? So I am very curious about that. We're going to do a separate discussion on it.
Please, because we can talk about the de-investment of public transportation. We can talk about just the physical layout of things. We can talk about the obsession that certain white Americans have with graffiti, right? And all of the literature that we have over the years about what that means. So yes, count me in. I'm already a yes.
Excellent.
Oh, so if I could jump in on
Senator,
2 points that were made before. First, about the notion of DAs and being disconnected from county the attorney generals and being disconnected from county DAs. I think that's a very good point. I think that we've been talking on a legislative end on this call. What we haven't talked about is politics. Mm-hmm. And so although, yeah, we're having riots and all those things in New York City is very, very different than what it was under Michael Bloomberg or under Rudy Giuliani, exactly because Black people elected a mayor who understood the issues around policing and got rid of things like stop and frisk, right? And then the other thing that we did across the city of New York is that we first elected Ken Thompson, God rest his soul, and then Eric Gonzalez, the first Puerto Rican elected statewide, in a district attorney role. We have Darcel Clark in the Bronx. We have Melinda Katz, a white progressive in Queens. And so we have actually taken over our DA's offices, right? And that's made a significant difference. And so on one hand, you're going to need to pass legislation. On the other hand, electoral mobilization is going to be important to get out people who are not on your side, who are not progressive, who are not standing up for the issues that are important for you. And then as it relates to the issue of use of force, I agree. California actually did some model legislation that they passed around use of force. I've adopted that for New York. I have the bill in and arguing to try to get that done in a package next week as well. But this use of force legislation, I think, is absolutely critical, and putting some guidelines around the practice, but some transparency and accountability for police when they do use force, I think is the important thing, and not necessarily this notion of guns versus not guns, tasers or having some kind of auxiliary stops. That's half the problem already. People make the argument that Black communities are over-policed. I disagree 1,000%. We're actually under-policed. We're actually under-policed. Because if, God forbid, something happens to your property or my property, or God forbid, a family member, we get less service. It's less fast, less responsive, less investigatory than white communities, which is why crime happens in our community, because even the criminals know that if you commit a crime in a Black or Latino community, you are less likely to be caught, prosecuted, or chased than you would be if you're in a white community.
That's a good point.
And so that's a part of the dynamic we're dealing with as well.
Well, so as we're wrapping up, I just wanted to recognize or point out, we had Maine State Representative Denise Tepler, who was spotlighting a recent Living While Black bill that she's introduced in Maine using the Grand Rapids, Michigan model. And she was asking if that was the right one to use. We're going to do some follow-up with these questions, by the way, for our audience members who've been tuning in to our Micro Summit discussion. We're going to curate these comments and questions that you put in the Zoom group chat and use them at some later point. These Micro Summit discussions are at a later point translated or transformed into actual policy discussions amongst CSG East legislators. And then we look at exploring potential legislation or policy down the road, either through policy suggestions or draft legislation at some point in the future. So we appreciate the legislators who are chiming in or who are watching our Micro Summit now. Debbie Page also providing us with, and some of the representatives and state senators, legislators who are tuning in, providing copies or links to bills or draft legislation on this topic. I know we didn't cover everything, but definitely a fairly good start. People also making on that question about non or unarmed auxiliary police. Debbie Page making the point that, remember, George Floyd wasn't killed by either a gun or a taser. It was by a knee. So that's something we have to keep in mind there as well. And definitely appreciate that, Debbie. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this Micro Summit discussion. Really appreciate everyone's time here on panel today. I know we had Representative Chris Rabb, who was on earlier. I know he's been very busy, kind of on the go. Did appreciate him coming in a little bit earlier. Also, we've been talking with State Senator Kevin Parker, and want to thank him as well as chair of the Council of Communities of Color within the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. Been doing a wonderful job there, and making this Micro Summit series, this discussion. We started off talking about COVID-19 equity gaps and of course, it's metastasized into discussions about other things, other very pressing issues, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can continue doing that. So State Senator Kevin Parker, 21st Senatorial District, the People's Republic of Brooklyn, we appreciate you. Thanks so much. Christina Greer, really appreciate your time as well. Politics editor of thegrio.com, political science professor at Fordham University. Go to @dr_CM Greer for engagement on social media, on Twitter. Oh, before I forget, go back to Senator Parker, @Senator Parker on Twitter for engagement on social media there as well. Also want to thank the other sister on the panel, Professor Kalila Brown, Dean, political science professor at Quinnipiac University. Very easy, go to kbdphd.com. Check out our book, Identity Politics in America, as well. Thank you so much. It's great to reconnect with you as well. Michael Cord, Angriest Black Man in America, @Michael Cord on Twitter, on social media, also regular columnist for the Philadelphia Tribune, civil rights and criminal defense attorney, long time in Philadelphia, my hometown of Philadelphia. Really appreciate that. Martin Pratt just showed up, Your Black News Philly, also one of the facilitators of these events, these micro summits on the back end, making sure that everything's squared away as far as the technical back end of things. Really appreciate him also making these possible. And want to thank Debbie Ann Page as well, Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. Thank everyone. Thank the audience too. Thank you for your questions and your comments. We'll make sure to relay those and this is also being recorded. It is a public affair. We are going to record it and also share it on a number of digital platforms and social media as well. I am Charles Ellison. I've been your moderator for these micro summit discussions. I will probably see you next week. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everyone. You'll see me next week probably, or the week after. We're going to continue this. You can catch me at Ellison Report on Twitter, at Ellison Report, also the BEnote.com, of which I'm the publisher, or you can hear me every weekday except Fridays. I'm off on Fridays, but I'm the host, executive producer of Reality Check on WURD Radio in Philadelphia, or you can just tune in anywhere in the nation at wordradio.com or by Word app as well. And many of the folks that have been on this panel, actually everyone that's on this panel has been on Reality Check WRD, so I appreciate your time doing something else, another great project, these micro summits. Okay, I'm signing off. I want to thank everyone. Please have a very safe weekend. Have a safe and restful weekend. We'll see you again. Take care.